the South, I think, is a sacred place because of its story. So I would suggest that like things that are sacred because of their story. Like there's sacred stories, and like a cemetery is sacred because all the stories that lie in the soil in those places, and um, and it's meaningful not because the stories are dead, right? The sacred lives forever.
Hey, Bryson. So thanks so much for meeting with us and allowing us to interview you on our first like podcast under kind of the Black South umbrella. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Appreciate y'all.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll start with you. Just give an introduction of your name, who you are, and what you do.
Okay, sure. So yeah, I'm Bryson. I do a few different things. I'm really grateful to be a professor at a local university in Canton, Ohio, called Malone University, and I'm a professor of sociology and criminal restorative justice. And I also am grateful to be a pastor in my community in Akron, um, and also do some nonprofit work around the neighborhood and around our region as well. So pastor, teacher, professor, community organizer, and neighbor, husband as well, and father. So lots of different hats, but yeah, they really feel like a privilege to wear them, each one of them in their own distinct meanings. So.
Oh, it sounds like you do a lot and a lot of good work.
Yeah, I didn't know you were a pastor too. That's actually really dope.
Yeah. So we have a pastoral team, and I'm an organizer within that our church, and so I've been doing that for several years, and grateful for that. Yeah, I don't preach necessarily. When people hear pastor, they tend to think, oh, you're the main guy, the main preacher. We have sort of a shared leadership model that I've helped to sort of institute. So I don't necessarily preach every Sunday or do things like that, but I certainly shepherd and do a lot of teaching and preaching, but a number of other things as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the second question is kind of going to be like, why you do all that stuff? I want to ask it in a little bit more fancy of a way. Um, so I'm doing wanting to do my PhD research on studying the African American missional witness of God and His kingdom. And I'm wanting to maybe do a historical research on that, but also looking at the current institutions and individuals now who are African Americans and how they are a witness of God and His kingdom in their time and context, and why they believe their vocation matches that missional calling. So, with all of that, kind of why do you believe that what you do now matches up with the missional calling of being a witness of God and His kingdom and Jesus?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a deep question. I think that language probably needs to parse out a little bit, but I think one of the unique gifts that like the African diaspora brings, like people of African ancestry with people with black skin, dark skin, brown skin, right? There's a particular epistemology, like a way of being in the world, a way of knowing, a way of seeing a particular worldview, in a particular like even a process of knowledge creation and knowledge interpretation that it tends to be a bit more holistic than our sort of Western like post-enlightenment approach to knowledge, which you might even call like a white logic or a white epistemology, or we tend to think of it like a westernized view of the world, where like we have this Cartesian split, or Rene Descartes, where like the body and the mind are separate, and you see that even in like the justification rationalization of slavery, where Christian slave owners were still Christian, yet a slave owner. So there's sort of like inherent dichotomy and paradox of that. So then went on to use a sort of Cartesian way of thinking, an enlightenment way of thinking, to justify maintaining these bodies as chattel, as product, as objects, while still sort of honoring somehow their God-given dignity. And so they would do that by saying, well, we will baptize you in the name of Jesus Christ, but it's only for your soul. It's only for the sake of your soul. And but your body will still remain my property. And you actually will have to, like say this, like you have to pledge this upon your baptism, that as you get baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, you still give me claim to your body, but your soul has been saved, right? So this pervasive way of thinking that even, I grew up in a United Baptist church, traditionally Black church, and we have our motto, our mantra was saving souls and salvaging lives. So there's a bit of a reconciling of those two things, but you can still see that that bifurcated way of thinking. Like we save souls primarily, and then we also salvage lives. And there's a little bit of connection there, but you can see how that kind of separates as well. So even like that is pervasive in sort of modern ways of modern Christianity, and even in the Black church. But getting back to like this pre-enlightened way of thinking, and this sort of Eastern or like Afrocentric way of thinking, I tend to think of it as more holistic. It's not as separate. It's not as like sacred secular divide, or body mind divide, or soul spiritual gospel versus social gospel divide. And so that's how I tend to like try to think about my own, like getting back to your question, my own connection between like my vocation and like my missional stance and position and work. Like I think it's all spiritual, right? So like the way that I woke up every morning for like 3 years in the middle of the night to comfort my child because she just couldn't sleep at the night, like that was my vocation. And it was sacred work that was absolutely missional, right? So it's important to think about like how we're defining, like how we're operationalizing that term missional. But what I tend to like my particular epistemology or like way of understanding it is to flatten the structure of and to democratize it in a way. So that like when I think of mission, it's not just sort of captured by like this like colonial way of thinking, like coloniality, and but rather it's this understanding that like I'm connected to planet, I'm connected to people, I'm connected to God, whether I know it or not. This divine essence that is the same essence that birthed the stars into being. And when I live in a way that aligns with that ruah, that spirit, the same spirit that's swirling around the universe, like when I live in alignment with that, with integrity, I'm doing the mission of God, which is to flourish, right? Which is to flourish in a way that like brings prosperity in all ways, and wholeness to everything, right? To all things, like all things being restored and being made new. Not simply about me having this like separate sacred work that I pursue in the name of God, but in a way, it's like honoring the incarnation of Jesus, which is to say that like in many ways, like this whole thing's like sacred, y'all. Like when you live as a human, it is in many ways the insignia of being divine, and being in the world in a way that represents the transcendent, right? So that's a super long response, and like probably doing the most, but I was trying to reconcile that. Like I can certainly like be specific about like professorship, right, and like pastoring as these occupations that get into like that touch my vocation and how that serves my neighbor. Absolutely. But I try to create more of a, at least my personal stance is like, how are all these things connected? And how do I do it even on accident? Because it's just part of my DNA. It's part of my spiritual DNA and my spiritual inheritance as a Black person as well.
You go.
Because I was going to ask one, but I'm curious, Bryson, what you would say, because I feel like I know several people that there's this journey of folks that maybe don't have that mindset yet, but are like walking in the direction of seeing the connectivity of flourishing and being connected to God, to the earth, all of those things. For your own story and journey, how did you get there? Like I'm assuming that maybe you weren't born with that mindset per se, but what were some of the maybe peak moments in your life that moved you to this understanding that you have as your missional vocational calling is all connected?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I would argue that in some ways we are born with that. Like we learn these divisions. Like my daughter, I have a daughter who's 5 and a daughter who's 2, and like they don't think of, like, when they pray, they don't close their eyes because that's goofy. Like, you know, like they don't close their eyes to pray. They don't look up. They haven't learned the sort of tripartite way of understanding the world. Like there's a heaven up there somewhere. We're on the, you know, the parallel, this flat realm of whatever, and then hell somewhere below us. Like they kind of see it connected in many ways. And I think then what happens is we're raised where, like, almost the preeminent formational pillars of society are about disconnecting us from each other. And we want to blame that on Satan as Christian oftentimes. Like Satan's this little red devil running around with a pitchfork trying to stab you in the neck. But like our battle's not against flesh and blood, it's against powers and principalities. And those powers are very literal structures and systems that say, instead of looking at your partner right next to you, Erin, like, look at your phone. Right. And I'm going to do the best I can to capture and keep captive your attention to this device, like, as much as I can, right? Like using science, right? So there's all these ways, not to pick on technology. We know it has pros and cons, but so our children are spiritually formed to disconnect from everything, from each other, from God, from planet, from self. And then we have to go, you know, we grow up eventually and we're like, dang, I need counseling. And then the counselor's like, let's get back in our body. Like, let's reconnect with ourselves, right? So I think we do learn it in many ways, but my journey has been interesting in the sense that I've always just been curious, and I've always had sort of maybe it's just, again, my spiritual inheritance, like a prophetic imagination. Like some of the stuff just ain't right. Like I don't agree with some of these things, and so I always just found it strange, like the ways that we were so disjointed from each other and disjointed from things. And even, like, I remember first time I heard about like the 3 R's, not CCDARs, the reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah.
In like 4th grade, and I was like, this makes so much sense. Like, why do we even have to talk about this, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So I always just had this imagination of, like, yeah, like we got to do better. Why are we throwing trash in the ground and burying it like that?
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
like, that seems
Yeah.
odd. Even I'm 9 years old, and that seems odd, right? I wouldn't
Yeah.
do it in the backyard. So
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
so there's always, I think, an inheritance of that. Maybe that maybe my mom invested into me. Maybe it's just a spiritual inheritance, whatever it is. But I think it's been helpful for me. I was part of an organization for many years called Made to Flourish, and that was really formational as well. Made to Flourish is still exists. It's a great organization that is about, like, faith and work integration and how to bridge the Sunday to Monday divide, or many of us Christians, because of that sacred secular divide mythology, like, we think that all the holy stuff happens on Sunday, and then you just get through the week to get back to Sunday. And so how do we bridge that divide, and how do you help people to understand that, like, just what y'all said, like, your what's your calling in the world, and how do you live it out in a way that's not just secluded to what happens on a Sunday, or like when you're praying before a meal, and all the stuff that we stereotypically think as religious or spiritual. And that was formation. I was in that group for a while, and so I got to read a lot of literature and be around a lot of thought leaders who were helping me, and helping me like give language to those things that sort of already may have been resonating with me or feeling or expressing, but then also challenge me and form me deeper into that a way of thinking that that again, like sort of seeks to dissolve that this idea that these hierarchical ideas on one hand, that like somehow pastor whoever it is, fill in the name, is more holy than me, more sacred than, because he has a spiritual vocation. So I might be a lawyer, I might be a teacher, I might be a coach, I might be literally raising your kids as a teacher. But then I look at pastor, I'm like, yeah, your job's, thank God for you, because like if we didn't have you,
Right.
what would we do on Sundays? And it's like, no, you're literally like, you're forming our kids. You're
Right.
with my kids more than me, for a lot
Right.
of parents. And you're looking at me like my job's more important than you. Like that's crazy, but like that's
Right.
powers and principalities that sort of deceive us, like Satan, the deceiver,
Yeah.
saying like, you're not important unless you have some like job in the Holy of Holies.
Yeah.
That's odd. So that was also helpful, made to flourish. You should check them out. They have a
Yeah.
great website, great resources as well. And thinking along these lines of vocation, and work.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. I think I love your answer to that vocation call, right? Not just being something spiritual, but more holistic, and using you fathering your daughter as an example of comforting her. And so I think I'm curious, maybe you can speak on this on an individual sense, but then also on a communal sense of what are the barriers you found in your own life that prevent you from living out that vocation and that missional calling. And then also on a communal sense, what do you feel like is the barrier specifically for African American institutions or individuals that allow them to fill out their missional calling in our country and in the context? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'll start talking, and feel free to rein me in. And also feel free to remind me that the two-part question, I might forget the second part. But I think for me personally, so we're approaching Lent. Right, Lent starts on Wednesday. It's Valentine's Day and Lent, which is it's very ironic, in some ways. Anyways, so Lent's this 40-day fast for the feast of resurrection, right? The celebration of resurrection. And you traditionally in the Christian church, in many traditions, not everyone, you use Lent as a practice of self-deprivation. Like, what can I deprive myself of? What can I fast from, so that I can fully embrace the gravity of this liturgical season, and be transformed by it, right? Permanently. It's not just like, let me give up coffee for 40 days and then drink more of it after that. But like, how can me giving up coffee or chocolate or something, like these little acts, particularly in our privileged world, can actually build they're formational in many ways. And I think that the beauty of Lent, Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, one of the premier Old Testament scholars in our century, he wrote a really simple Lenten devotional called "A Way Other Than Our Own," I believe, and it's based around this concept of like our baptismal identity. So in the church, when you get baptized, it wasn't simply just like a spooky thing, like some spooky happening when you go into the water, you come back new. Absolutely, like there's a spooky element of it. But it was like getting your driver's license in those times. Like, it was like getting your degree. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was like a rite of passage. It was like, now you're part of the Yahweh tribe. You know what I'm saying? Like, now you're part on the narrow way of Jesus. Like, you're in. Like it was a symbol of that. And so what he's suggesting is like, we have this baptismal identity that has like really practical implications, but we're always something's always coming to steal it, right? So part of our baptismal identity, and what one of the Brueggemann hits on heavy is Sabbath, right? So if you were to baptize people, like, because we go back to the Hebrews and being delivered and all that stuff, like, and never forgetting that stuff, like, you got a Sabbath, like that's part of your identity. It's not just like a day that you rest; it's a lifestyle. You know what I'm saying? Like, and so you got to fight for it though, because what the culture is doing is coming after Sabbath. Right? We got soccer practice on Sunday 3 times. All the tournaments are on weekends. Like, uh, you got to grind just to make like a living wage. You got to work like 2, 3 jobs, like especially if you're Black, right? Or especially for my class in many ways. And he's saying like we lose our baptismal identity um, not by like osmosis, right? Like, it just happened. And it was actually like an intentional attack in many ways when we're living in the world, but not deciding to not be of the world. And so like those are the threats. The threats are everywhere. Of like he actually uses this imagery of a frog, like, and I've never done this before, but it sounds right. Like you put a frog in a boiling pot of water, like the frog doesn't know it's getting boiled, right? It's just
Right.
the water's heating up and the frog's chilling because the frogs like water. And then like before you know it, the frog is food, right? And that's what it means just to be in the world, is that there's all these narratives, these stories, and we're story people, and there's all these stories that are inviting us, wooing us, right? Wooing us into fidelity to them.
Wow.
Whether that's capitalism, whether that's Christian nationalism, whether that's male dominance and patriarchy, whether that's whatever it is, racism, all the different stories, and we don't recognize that, and so we're like the frog. We're just in the water, and we don't even know we're getting boiled, but we are. And so the ways to maintain your baptismal identity, like that's why Lent is a beautiful thing. It's to say for these 40 days, I'm going to remind myself of who I am. I'm going to remind myself of Sabbath. I'm going to remind myself of rest. I'm going to remind myself that like the things I own don't belong to me. So I'm going to be even more generous during this time of reflection and Lent and devotion. And so the things that come and attack us are all those things I just mentioned, like these stories. And for me personally, I work and to make a living for my family, along with my wife, and it's super easy just to like let that pursuit of financial stability and financial comfort, like that story, deceive me away from my baptismal identity. Like I need that more than I need God. That Jesus says, put first the kingdom and you'll be all right. But I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like I better work it out myself, really, Jesus. and then I'll trust the kingdom once I put myself in a really fair and comfortable position. So I think as a Christian, there's some really interesting like way to think of it. And that's particularly how I think of it because I am a Christian. And so like putting that in the context of like the Black community is a really interesting question as well. Because like it's interesting when you're like a part of like a minoritized group, a marginalized group, what it means to thrive in that space. So there's actual like barriers put in the way to your flourishing, historic and modern, and that changes the context of like in the meaning of certain things, right? So let's think of like the suburbs, for example, right? The suburbs are a policy. They were a policy put into place in the early and mid 20th century that were subsidizing white flight, subsidizing white people getting away from Black people, because the one thing we don't want to be around is the other. And so Black people are moving up to the South, right? And up from the South, they're moving into cities, and white people are moving out of cities. Black people are getting some wealth, right? They're building a little bit of money. So now they're able to move into some of these neighborhoods that white folk dominated. And white folk are like, nah, you're not taking down our property values. We're not racist. We just care about money, if that's possible. And so they keep, white people moving further and further out from these cities. And now we're in a place where like we can get a decent job and make a decent living. And we're thinking, so where do I live? Where do I live? Do I move to the suburb? So if you're a Black person or a poor person, you're like, I was raised in the hood. Like, I am not trying to live in the hood anymore.
Right.
I'm trying to get out of it.
Right.
What's your option? To move to the suburb, which is like a direct artifact of racism, right?
Yes.
Direct artifact of part of what made you poor in the first place.
Yep.
So you're choosing, like, do I choose this evil, like this evil thing that was constructed to concentrate me with other suffering people?
Right.
Do I get to choose that now? And I think it gets real complex because like, you certainly shouldn't be relegated to continuing suffering for the sake of, whatever. Like, you should have the right at this point to say, like, I suffered enough. Like, my ancestors suffered enough. So I'm gonna move to the suburbs and we're gonna live a nice, easy life. But what happens when you do that is, like, not only are we now complicit in the same system that oppressed us, but now those same streams that perverted the logic of whiteness are now going to be infiltrating our logic. Comfort, security, distancing, disjointing, disconnecting. And so I think the same streams are wooing Black people in many ways. We can carry it and hit it a little bit different. It might hit different for us. And we might be able to carry it in a way that doesn't produce as deep of like ethnocentrism and like othering and like distancing. But I think we should still be really cautious of them. Like if we're gonna escape the plantation, we probably shouldn't we shouldn't like move back to it and use the same methodology and then say we're free. Because I'm not free. We can't be free if everyone's not free. And that freedom is also a sort of way of being in the world that has been oppressive since 1619 and before, right? So so Audre Lorde says that, like, you can't use the master's tools to destroy the master's house. I'm paraphrasing here, but in many ways, I think that's one of the greatest barriers for Black prosperity and Black flourishing, spiritually, economically, emotionally, in every way, is like, how do we actually escape the master's tools, not just the master's house, right?
Final question for you, Bryson, is we would be doing a disservice if we did not tell the public that it is you who helped us craft the language around the South being sacred. Like, we've literally put it on a shirt, and so we just say thank you publicly also. But I think it would be wonderful to have a recorded public conversation just about the sacredness of the South. And some of those thoughts, if you could speak into that a bit more. I think as we've crafted language, and you can speak into it too, Kendall, is like, we really formed ourselves around this identity of part of our cultural identity being in the soil of the South, and also how the blood cries out of the soil. And I think that's part of our journey in reverse migration too, is that the South is literally calling us, literally almost by name. Like, I've literally had some visions of my ancestors telling me to read this book or just saying hi to me. It's like really strange, but also like, I know it's spiritually divine and all connected, to your point earlier about how all things are connected. And so I would just love for you to speak into that a little bit more. And did you have anything else you wanted to say about it before he answers?
I think that everything you're saying before is a beautiful tie to all of that, because right? How to not use the master's tools and become assimilated, I think is part of the heart of Black South. And what we're trying to start is there's this migration, right? Story of like returning back to like our ancestors' practices, our ancestors' old homeland space is a little bit of the heart of Black South, of what we're founding. And I think that being connected to the South being a sacred space to return to all of that. And we understand in this reverse migration narrative of what we're doing with Black South, not everyone is able to do that in a sense, right? But even without being able to go back to the South to reclaim a part of their cultural identity, an ancestral identity, how can people still build that? I don't know if the word is decolonize, right? How can people still reclaim that part of themselves that God created them to be, while also maybe answering Erin's question too, of why the South is sacred?
Yeah. Oh, these are great questions. Yeah, I'll try to be more succinct than I have been. But so I think we all recognize sacred spaces. Even, I won't speak for atheists because I'm not one. But I doubt an atheist would like drive their bicycle over like graves, you know what I'm saying? Like just frolicking around a cemetery, like, they're just dead bodies. Like, who cares if I have a picnic on this gravesite? You know what I'm saying? Like, there's a maybe even Jonathan Haidt would argue, who's a moral philosopher who wrote the book The Righteous Mind, that we have these moral foundations, that they're human, they're pre-wired into us, and it helps to explain like our evolutionary trajectory of like, how do we get to where we are, right? And so whether you're Buddhist, atheist, Christian, agnostic, whatever, like there's these moral foundations, one of which is the ability to recognize like that which is sacred, and sacred doesn't have to even be necessarily understood through like a religious lens, just like something that's set apart, something that has like immense value and meaning inherently within it. Like the South, I think, is a sacred place because of its story. So I would suggest that like things that are sacred because of their story. Like there's sacred stories, and like a cemetery is sacred because all the stories that lie in the soil in those places, and it's meaningful not because the stories are dead, right? The sacred lives forever, right? That's our idea, our conceptions of eternity, and so those stories actually haven't died. Like they still live on. They have escaped. They have escaped the soil, and they influence the continuing story that's being written. And like that's the South. Like the South is a story of our country, right? The South is a story of 4 million slaves, and the South is the story of 2,500 lynched Black bodies in 20 years, and those bodies like swinging from trees and then being thrown into a river. But those stories don't die. Those stories have framed like the very ground that we stand on, like Black or white, wherever they have been framed, and they've been foundationally supported by those stories. And everyone has a moral foundation for recognizing the sacred, even if it doesn't have religious connotation for you. And I think recognizing the South as a sacred space, particularly because of its history, its racialized history, can and should inform, and will inform, regardless of whether we recognize it or not. It has informed and will continue to form, and should more intentionally inform like our identities moving forward, like the new stories that are created both in civic space, politically, economically, and social spiritually, like in every way. And I think that permeates our whole like geographic, our whole landscape of our country. So like you said, if you're not Black and able to move back to the South or whatever the case may be, like how does a sacred South change you? And I think that's how, because it's a story that we can all lean into. And as we do that, it transforms us. And it's like a restoring process as well. Like it's this iterative process of give and take and mutuality and reciprocity that like I get to continue to recreate the story, but it never leaves the parameters that were set by Emmett Till. It never leaves the parameters that were set by our heroes of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Like they set the stage in such a way that we can continue to recreate the story, but it'll always be founded on principles of justice and human dignity and life and love and liberty. It'll always be founded on these ideas that perfected this democracy. That's perfecting it. Like this democracy is perfected by the deprivation of Black people from our country and all these things, right? So I think that's a compelling story that both inspires but also provides a prophetic imagination for a Black person wherever you are, that I'm a part of this and I can decide now more than ever how I want to participate in the recreating that sacred story and what legacy I want to leave and plant in the soil of my place that might inspire future generations.
That's great. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us and for chatting it up and allowing us just to share a space to process and talk about sacred things. It's super meaningful. Yeah. And the last question would just be if anybody wants to support you in your work and maybe get involved with what you're doing, maybe if you could provide some links or resources or what have you to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm sort of odd. I don't really market myself, but you can email me.
There you go. Good old email.
This is my first name, Bryson, at Akron, AKRON, L as in life, F as in frog.org. So you can hit me up that way, and I would love to connect and just build some relationships. I do stuff, as you know, as I already said, I do quite a bit of stuff. So I teach and lead workshops and do consulting and all those things. I'm a PhD candidate, so I'm finishing my dissertation.
Awesome.
So
congrats.
So I would encourage you this summer. Hopefully it'll be done. You can check out some of my research, and I have a few papers that are one has already been published and a couple of other papers in the works. So you can check out some of my research, which is relevant to the Black experience. So yeah, that's probably I don't have any social media besides LinkedIn, which I don't really count as social media.
Yeah.
So email is the best way to get in touch with me, and I'm all about relationships. So just reach out and hopefully we can be friends.
I love it.
Cool. Love that, man.
Yes.
Thanks so much for meeting with us. I'm inspired.
Yeah, thank y'all.
Of course.
I want to shout y'all out as well. I know I'm the interviewee, I guess, but I like to disrupt the power structures. So I just want to give a shout out to Erin and Kendall and just the amazing hearts that y'all have. And we could easily have flipped the script and I could have interviewed y'all and it would have been as, if not more compelling. So I just want to bless y'all and the work that you're doing and just say, go get it. We need y'all and we need your work and your creativity. So, support Erin and Kendall. Support them big time. They probably do have social media. Follow them. Support them because they're amazing.
Thank you so much, Bryson.
Appreciate you, man.
Appreciate you.
Yeah, for sure.